Yay.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us. And we will start, of course, with our bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'dinei Torah.
Amen.
Thank you.
Does it matter?
Just waiting for the screen to share. There we go. And be sure if you be on mute in case you have a side conversation and it gets recorded. But if you want to ask a question, of course, please unmute. So we are in the midst of this discussion of the false prophet, right? We had discussed a bunch of different kinds of things, including the eating of chulim meat as opposed to sacrificial meat and things like that. And basically the idea of following the commandments, following the mitzvot. So we then went into the idea of a prophet who prophesies falsely in the sense of following other gods, and yet at the same time, this prophet has made a sign, has used a sign or a miracle, performed a miracle of some kind, which might lead us to think that he's telling the truth. And we had a wonderful Rashi, and even based on a scriptural passage, saying God is testing us. That's the reason why. So let's make sure I have the place. We did that. And let me find it. Here we are. Acharei Hashem Elohechem telechu v'oto tira'u. So this is a interesting, right, verse. After the Lord your God you shall go, oto tira'u, and him you shall fear. And sorry, I need someone to mute there. And it's interesting, we always get into this thing about fearing God. But basically, to fear God means not doing anything that would be considered sinful, even if no one else would ever find out about it. To be able to be very loyal and honest and upright in your very private place, in your very private life. And that's what is being referred to here. But the idea also of recognizing God's ineffable power, that God is so powerful, we wouldn't even be able to describe it. It is so amazing. And to recognize that. Acharei, let's see, going on here. Sorry, we did not finish the sentence. Ve'et mitzvotav tishmoru, and guard his commandments. So it's not just saying to perform them, it's saying to guard them. And the implication of this, which is very human, is that it's so easy to have a negative attitude towards being commanded, or else to think that they're insignificant and aren't worth fulfilling. And yet it is precisely, I think, the genius of Judaism to say that the way in which you actually display the love that you have and the degree to which you are following God and loving God is by performing God's commandments, by being willing to submit your own ego, to submerge your own ego into what God asks of you. I have actually a cartoon from the New Yorker that's cute. I don't have a copy of it on my computer, but basically Moses is talking to God and saying, so it's basically about what you want. So anyway, Uvekolo tishma'u, and you shall listen, hearken to his voice. Rashi is going to pull this apart for us and give us clearer, understandings of this. For oto ta'avodu, and you shall serve him. Uvot tidbakun, and you shall cling to him. So what the sentence is saying in general is that it takes effort, that it does take effort to do these kinds of things. And I guess the other observation I'd make is how long ago these words were said. The whole idea that it takes effort to serve God and to desire to serve God and to live this kind of life. Ve'et mitzvotav tishmor, and you shall guard his commandments. So what mitzvotav, what commandments are we talking about? And according to the Sifrei, Torat Moshe, meaning, of course, the 5 books. Uvakolo tishma'u, and you shall listen to his voice. And interesting interpretation, the kol nevi'im, listening to the voice of the prophets, right? The second part of our scriptures. And if you ever do study the prophets, if you were to try and analyze what links them all together, is that as opposed to necessarily giving specific mitzvot, they talk in general, they have a critique on not being loyal to God. So they deal perhaps on a broader spiritual level with the need and the consequences of turning away from living a life of righteousness. And again, it takes effort. V'oto ta'avodu, and you shall serve him b'mikdasho, in his sanctuary. And of course, this is referring ultimately to the temple, but that's because the temple had, as you know, sacrifices and other formal physical activities that we don't do in the synagogue. The synagogue is a reflection of that. We talk about a mikdash ma'at, a small sanctuary, but we don't practice these kinds of things anywhere at this point. And this has been, of course, for millennia, except in the temple. And that's why traditionally we long for the rebuilding of the temple and the idea that we would be able to serve God in the way God has asked us to serve him. Ovot tidbakun, and you shall cling to him. And this is in the Talmud, in the tractate Sota, page 14. This is lovely, by the way. Hadbeik bid rachav, cling to his ways, meaning gemul chasadim, practice acts of loving kindness. Kvor meitim, make sure that the dead are properly buried. Baker cholim, visit the sick. Kamo she'asa HaKadosh Baruch Hu, just as the Holy One himself did. So that's, again, when you look at this, essentially, we're looking at a situation where we're relating, for the most part, to people who are in unfortunate circumstances, and the idea of acting in a way that takes their welfare into account. And it's been said before, I really believe it, that the level of any civilization, the measure of any civilization's greatness, has to do with how it takes care of its disadvantaged, how those people are in poverty and illness and in desperate straits are being supported by the community. That is a measure of the community's greatness, not its buildings, not its power, not its armies, none of that, but what I just said. V'hanavi, and as for the prophet, hahu, that prophet, o cholem hachalom, or that dreamer of dreams, or that one who has visions, I suppose we would say, hahu, that one, yumat, shall be put to death. Ki diber sarah al Hashem Elokechem, for he has spoken transgression. We'll see how Rashi understands this, regarding the Lord your God, Hamotzi etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, v'habotcha mibeit avadim, and who redeemed you from the house of bondage, of slavery. Lahadichacha, this is going back now on what the prophet is doing. In other words, this is what he's done against God, who you owe so much to, and he is trying to thrust you aside, min haderech, from the way, asher tzivcha Hashem Elokecha lalechet ba, which the Lord your God commanded you to go in it, to walk in it, uvi'arta hara mekir becha, so that you can remove entirely or clear out the wickedness that is in your midst, that is in your heart, the heart of you. So again, this is one of those hard statements, the idea of capital punishment when it comes to someone for sharing ideas. And of course, this isn't practiced nowadays. I don't know that I necessarily, personally, would feel comfortable about seeing it actually carried out. But I think the importance of reading a statement such as this, and we come across these, and this is basically the approach I have, is to try and articulate just how obnoxious such behavior is, and how antithetical it is, and how much it can undermine and destroy a civilization, that it not only a civilization, but it's actually destructive to people's lives. And that these kinds of statements are saying, they're warnings, and they're saying, we need to be careful about this. And having said this, again, I can tell you that I don't try to isolate myself. I feel like I've learned great things that have helped me understand the Torah better from people who practice other religions or from the ideas of other religions. I've read the New Testament more than once. I did start to work on the Quran, and I can tell you that as long as you are studying these things carefully, they do not necessarily represent idolatry. Idolatry is far more invidious. It has to do with where you place ultimate values. It has to do with that, because that's how you serve something. When you think it's the most important thing in the world, then you tend to direct your life in that direction, and that can move you away from understanding your role and your relationship and your, I would say, need to create a relationship with the universe, and your understanding in that way. Yes, David.
And so I guess my question here is, and maybe this was covered before, is, are the false prophets just around the notion of, idolatry, or is it also the notion of, being against God, or is it both?
So I think that the one is involved in the other, that ultimately that one is involved in the other, that doing that is in fact being against God. That having this understanding that there is one ultimate, sole, unique, transcendent creator, and that it is our task as human beings to serve that creator and to live our lives in that direction. And it's not a black and white thing. It is something that is a journey, just as we've talked about this journey that the Israelites have taken. And the question is the direction of that journey. And that word lasur that was used, diber sarah, the word lasur means to turn aside. In other words, what this person is doing is he's telling us, he's trying to convince us to turn aside from this journey that we're supposed to be taking in the brief course of our lives. And
so go ahead. Sorry.
No, please.
Yeah. So it starts with idolatry then, right? I mean, that's where it starts with in terms of the convert. Is that correct?
I think so. I think that is what we're talking about. In other words, not serving God, not understanding the basic purpose of why we were created. I mean, we didn't create ourselves. We live in a universe that allows these miraculous events to take place. And here we are, something that I've been thinking about a lot lately is, where do we come from? Do we understand our real origins in terms of our own birth and our own consciousness? At what point did we become conscious human beings? And what process went into that whole notion of consciousness? We may look more at where we're going and simply deny that there's anything beyond this life, but part of that has to do with the fact that we don't really grapple and understand that we don't even know where we came from. And so as to where we're going, we should hold in the same position. Just as we don't know really our origins, we shouldn't be so sure that the end of life is nothing but annihilation. We shouldn't be so sure about it, And I think, again, people might live differently if they knew that there were going to be consequences to their behavior. All of us, right? I know that I would probably rethink some of the decisions I've made had I thought very carefully about the fact that I'm going to be held accountable for everything I do. And it's that notion of accountability that I think is so important. So these sort of statements, I feel, try to bolster up that awareness, because it's so easy to get caught into the into life itself, or the chores and the tasks and the pleasures, of this particular limited existence, that we can forget the big picture. And the Torah doesn't want us to forget the big picture. And it's trying to say it in ways that may touch us. And so sometimes, I'm not saying that, that this is pure hyperbole. I just do know that in actual fact, when you study the tractates that deal with capital cases and things like that, they went out of their way to avoid actually, executing anybody. They were very concerned about the possibility that a court might falsely execute someone. And we know for a fact, because there are executions in our country, that there are many executions that took place, and then afterwards they discovered it was under false information. They hadn't properly considered all the evidence. And that's murder, and we don't want to do that. So in fact, I know that there's even a statement about in the Talmud that says that any court that actually winds up executing someone is known as a murderous Beth Din. Such concern. But they don't take it off the books. And the reason they don't take it off the books, I believe, is because they don't want people to think it's, venial. It's not that important. And I think it's
Yep.
So,
thank you.
You bet. And I think this is probably a good place to stop here. And because in a sense, we get into a related but different topic. We're finished with the topic of the false prophet here, but we are not finished, unfortunately, with the idea of being misled to worship other gods, etc., etc. So this will be saved with God's help for next year, and I'm going to stop the share. All right. So any last comments before we move on? All right. Okay, we'll close this out, and I'll stop the recording. Thank you.